Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dean Leffingwell. Welcome to the final session of the SAFE 2020 Summit. I have to tell you, I couldn't be more excited about this session. I have a chance to moderate a panel with three of my heroes, people that I followed. I think I've read most words that they've written. They continue to inspire me. And so much of my personal work and so much of SAFE is built upon the principles and practices that the folks have brought to the industry. So I'm incredibly proud to have with me today Mik Kersten, Jean Kim, and Don Reinertsen. And the names alone kind of give me goosebumps. That's just really impressive. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to start off and have you briefly say hello and tell us what you're working on. We'll just get this dialogue started. I'm going to start with Mik because he's on the Zoom panel to my left. Hi, Mik.
Thank you. It is just such an honor to be here with everyone. And likewise, I've read every word that each one of you has written. And I continue to follow your work closely, as I think do all the people that I know, so that I follow. So what I've been working on has been this direction of business agility, right? I think we've all seen the benefits of Agile. We've understood them. We've elevated a lot of technical practices with what's happening with DevOps. But where we are with business agility and where the direction that SAFE is headed, I think is hitting some major roadblocks. And so I've been asking myself what those roadblocks are. I've been encouraged by the fact that large organizations now have leaders assigned to business agility, the chief transformation officers, the CIOs who've taken the role, the CTOs, the CIOs as well. But I think we've been missing the mark in a pretty big way. So what I've realized is that the operating model that the business has just simply does not match what we understand as Agile and DevOps practices, and those practices that will actually allow us to innovate more quickly. I think the amazing thing is, and the amazing thing to me about this panel is that the body of knowledge is there, right? The work of Don and the way that inspired me, the way that Dean, you've actually made it concrete for me and made it possible for me to implement it. And of course, the DevOps practices actually mean that we're seeing this, but when I'm actually measuring organizations where I'm working with my team and looking and measuring these flow metrics, I just sometimes get horrified. So to give you an example, last week we learned of an organization, a very large organization. The organization has actually been quite successful in some of their DevOps automation, not all the way there, and their safe practices. Their flow efficiency, so the ratio of how much time work items are being worked on to waiting, was 1%. I promise I keep getting surprised. Now, the reason for that is, and Don, this will make you cringe, so I'll just watch you closely here. The reason for that is because there's just no understanding of the notion of work in progress, right? So their queues are so large. The dev teams are doing well. The Agile role has actually gone well, but the amount of work in progress is so high. COVID brought it up, by the way, and COVID tanked their flow efficiency because all of a sudden everything had deadlines again. Because these initiatives had to move very quickly. This is a financial services institution. They had to change their policies. They had to bring new things to market, and it all backfired. And so to me, what I'm working on is just bringing some of these concepts that Don introduced in his book, that others like the rest of you have actually put into practice and put into very easy to implement, or just straightforward to implement frameworks and practices, and just trying to elevate that. So if we could just have the business side of this organization understand queuing theory and little bits of Little's Law, and realize that if they brought down the whip, they would get more, not less, they would be in a completely different situation. So that's what I'm working on, is just trying to basically, I've given up on trying to convince people of the theory. I've now pivoted to helping people measure the effects of what happens when your flow efficiency is trending to 1%. And that's my approach to helping them understand the work of Don and product development flow.
Mik, sorry, just to make sure I understand. So flow efficiency of 1% means that people are only spending 1% of the time working, 99% of the time waiting. Is that?
But it's at the work item artifacts. So if you think of collectively of every single work item, every business epic, every feature, every user story, every enabler in a value stream. So everything going through the art, the ratio of active work time on those by anyone. So it could be a designer, a developer, a tester, an SRE, to their wait states is 1%. And I know I get horrified when on any of in my organization's value stream, flow efficiency dips below 50%, because I know something's going horrendously wrong, and developers are, the amount of thrashing that's happening and context switching is unsustainable. But yeah, 1%.
Gene.
I like
After
Mick.
the unicorn.
Yeah, right. By the way, first off, I have to say, like Mick, I have so much admiration for everyone on this panel, and going back in some cases over a decade. And I thought I've read all of Don Reinertsen's work, but invariably, at least once a quarter, Mick sends me something that you've written that I hadn't actually seen before. So I'm always dazzled again by the brilliance of what the people on this panel have done. What I've been working on these days, literally, is all around the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And so I've been running that since 2014. And really, this has been an area of passion for me. It's not studying the DevOps and the tech giants, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. It's really how it's being incorporated and adopted by the largest brands across every industry vertical. So it was really a conference for horses, not the unicorns. And just to maybe talk about why, I just have no doubt that despite how much economic value was created by the tech giants, that'll be dwarfed in comparison by what will happen when the 18 million developers on the planet that aren't in the FANGs are as productive as those who are. And so without a doubt that will add trillions of dollars of activity annually. And so all sorts of problems become solvable when we become we can actually become that much more productive. And what has dazzled me is just seeing the ascension of the people driving these transformations in large, complex organizations that have been quite happy doing things in the way they've always done it for decades. And so these are the rebels that really so much inspired so much of the Unicorn Project. They are overthrowing an ancient, powerful order. And in return, my observation is that they're getting promoted. They're being asked to take on more responsibilities because they know that they have the best long-term interest of the organization at heart. And and very much like Mick, I'm also horrified and aghast at just how many obstacles are in their way and to what extent the heroics are needed to be able to enable teams to be productive, teams to be able to independently develop, test, and create value for the customers without being entangled in the decades of technical debt that's shackling them, from being able to do what needs to get done. So, like Mick, I'm fascinated by the problem of, we know what we need to do, but there's something wrong with the structure and the resulting dynamics that's impeding technology leaders from doing what needs to get done.
Thanks, Gene. Don, welcome to our panel.
Thank you. I'm glad to be joining these luminaries. I guess the thing that I'm interested in now is sort of, I'm particularly interested in sort of prying the cold, dead hands of Deming off the product development process, because I see there's still this massive residual bias towards variability being intrinsically negative, and therefore you should end up eliminating it. And the understanding of variability operates through payoff functions, and it is the payoff functions that you have the ability to control and things like that. And in the presence of asymmetric payoff functions, variability can actually help the process rather than hurting it. And you see it, for example, in lean startup type ideas, where you say, if you try an idea out and the downside is very low and the upside is very high, then having a low probability of success is not an issue. You don't have to only do things that have high probability of success. But anyway, I've got a great deal of interest in how we think more clearly about the stochastic nature of product development without the reflexive waterfall manufacturing orientation towards all variability is bad.
So I'm going to trigger on that a little bit because Deming is one of my heroes, Don. I think you know that. And he was such a systems thinker before systems thinking was in vogue. And when I read his works, I don't see a heavy focus on lack of variability. I don't see the statistical process controlled Deming. I see the thinker that was literally decades ahead of his time. So please comment on that.
Oh, no, he had interesting ideas, but at the same time, if you probably remember vividly the funnel experiment he did with dropping the ball through the funnel, demonstrating that if you adjust the system in response to random variation, then you produce worse outcomes. You double the variability of the system. But that, in fact, is not true in product development. And many of Deming's ideas are very restricted to a small domain. And where he did the repetitive work of manufacturing, his voice was very accurate. When he generalized it into other domains is where he caused a lot of problems. And in fact, I would strongly argue that he had many defects in system thinking. His notion that prevention is always better than correction is locally optimizing correction cost instead of looking at correction cost and prevention cost being two components of an overall cost function, that you trade off one against the other. So I could go through Deming's books and say, how could you say this guy is a system thinker when he makes statements that are so blatantly looking at local optimizations? So we need to have a couple beers.
Hey,
And
Dean,
we're
can
off.
I? Yeah,
We're
if
off.
I may expound upon
Absolutely.
that, I mean,
Let's-
I might be one of those people who have maybe misinterpreted Deming. In fact, I think there's a certain, interpretation of the Phoenix Project that said, yes, absolutely, lean manufacturing is the equivalent of, some certain portion of the technology value stream. And I think kind of the aha moment I've had, since then is really there are two different parts of the value stream that have two very different characteristics. And this actually came from our mutual friend, Jez Humble. Is there's one part that's design and development that is highly experimental, highly variable, cycle times measured in weeks, months, or quarters, and that is absolutely a process of exploration, especially since the nature of the work is that you do it for the first time most of the time, maybe never again to be repeated. And then there's another portion which is build, test, and deploy, right? Which is, we want the exact opposite characteristics. We want them to have very little variability. We want them to happen in minutes, worst case hours. We want them to happen at the same time every time. And I think what's amazing is that the notion of code deployment lead time is such a great predictor of, the effectiveness of build, test, and deploy. But it's also a critical factor to create fast feedback loops so that we can experiment our way to success in design and development. And maybe the sort of like, as if that were not enough insult, right? Understanding that in 2015, I've been having weekly phone calls with my mentor, Dr. Stephen Spear, who wrote the most, I think, is the most downloaded Harvard Business Review paper of all time, Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System in 1999. And he said something to me a couple of weeks ago that just stunned me. He said, I've had the privilege of studying the miracle that is Toyota, and people still think it's about manufacturing. Right? In other words, the miracle isn't the manufacturing, even though it is miraculous. The real miracle is the system design and the continual process improvement that is integrated into the daily work of manufacturing that allows them to have had decades of world-beating performance. And so I guess it's my long way of saying I'm definitely guilty of maybe an overly broad interpretation of Deming, and I thank my lucky stars that the Phoenix Project was written in a way that didn't expose it, to everybody so bluntly.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not arguing throwaway Deming. I think my argument would be understand where it works, because when you have loss functions like the Taguchi loss function that you see in manufacturing, which are basically symmetric, then it is dead correct that minimizing variability is going to be the best thing to do. When you're designing experiments to try to generate information and things like that, if you drive the failure rate very low and think you drive the variability very low, you massively hamper your ability to generate information. And so I would simply argue it's not that Deming is evil, it's just that people generalize certain statements he makes and because he didn't understand where they work, he has convinced other people that they work universally, despite blatant examples in front of people where they are avoiding doing it.
And to be fair, he was not a product development guy, right? Was not a software guy. That was not his world. He was talking about government systems and manufacturing systems. Mick, do you have any response to that?
I do. I think we're at the crux of such an interesting topic. And I think some organizations who've been on one side of it have made some really fascinating mistakes from my point of view. So I'll actually frame this first as a question. So let's imagine, I think we've had a lot of practices in terms of these, the fuzzy front end versus the much more automatable deployment processes, right? So Gene, what you mentioned. But now let's imagine an organization who at scale has value streams whose flow time, so end-to-end time to value for bringing a new feature to market are under 7 days or under 1 week. And they're able to actually embrace variability. So they're able to design, develop, and release a new feature. And we actually got to observe that. Here's the fascinating thing. This exists. So we got to observe some of these organizations and the way that they brought new things to market during the shift in the pandemic. So these things exist. And all of a sudden, when you've got that kind of highly variable, systematized value stream, things just change because there's I think the split between fuzzy front end and then the back half of the value stream is not something you're looking at. What you've got instead is you've got a week-long or potentially shorter feedback loop. Your OODA loop has actually become that short. So now on the flip side of that, I've seen, and for that we know you, for example, need cloud, right? You need to do A/B testing. You need to be learning that quickly. You need to be able to ramp up and ramp down your workloads, and that's exactly what was happening to companies who were able to adapt very quickly to COVID. And there were some travel companies who did this, and a few different examples. So then take the flip side. You've got organizations who've taken, I think, the part of Deming that Don is pointing out can be problematic, which is they've focused so much on having the back end of their value stream highly automated and cloud-based, right? So they've rolled out AWS. It's now March, and they haven't actually set up the front end of their value streams, the part where the business is in the loop, where business agility does matter, where design matters, where you're able to push out a whole bunch of new screens to your customers that do something very different than what you were doing 2 weeks ago. Those organizations we've actually seen, even though they had cloud infrastructures and that focused on the back end of their value stream, they actually had that automation in place, they weren't able to do anything. And the example I gave was one of those was the one with a 1% flow efficiency. So I think we need to, the key thing of what Donna said to me, and that definitely with project to product I was looking at, is how do we take those principles that we learned on the back half of the value stream, the DevOps principles, and bring them forward. And to bring them forward, we need to embrace variability all the way through UX, right? If UX is a completely separate process that takes a month, none of this works, right? UX actually needs, user experience needs to be embedded right into your value stream. And so we need to structure these value streams for variability because companies like Amazon already have.
Can I just mention one pithy phrase that might delight everyone on this panel? I recently read Gene Kranz's book, Failure is Not an Option, about the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. But there's one phrase that I just loved. He said, the philosophy of NASA at that time, in order to achieve President Kennedy's goal to send a man to the moon on the Earth and return him safely back to Earth, was high risk, high gain. And there was one story about how they realized in 1960, I think it was early 1969, that as planned, the landing wouldn't happen until 1970. And so they did a dramatic replan of, it was either Apollo 8 or Apollo 9. They brought in lunar orbit, the lunar orbit maneuvers one mission earlier. And it just, to your point, Don, it's the goal isn't to manage the risk, right? It's to achieve the goal. And sometimes it is for high gain, and then you take on the accompanying risk. And I think I look forward to the day when we have the confidence that we can actually make those same type of decisions, high gain, and we're willing to take on high risk to do that.
This principle of variability is central to the way we think about product development. And if you think about large scale development now, everybody encourages, even the largest enterprises, to experiment, to explore, to MVP before they proceed with large investments. But part of that principle says things aren't always going to turn out the way you expected. And part of that principle, I says, mistakes will be made. So as we think about how we work with our decision makers, we empower others, how do we think about the mistakes that are going to occur? What guardrails do we need to allow that variability not to just put a giant release in the market that totally pollutes the brand? How do you think about variability, decision-making, and recovery from mistakes?
I think, to me, one of the edifying examples I've seen is, if you went to Facebook and you said, oh, you bring a new feature live in 24 hours and things like that, aren't you afraid that you are going to annoy a billion customers when you do that? And our traditional mentality of the way you avoid the consequences of annoying a billion customers is you make the probability of failure extremely low. You make it a Six Sigma design. But I think Facebook either implicitly or explicitly recognized that the consequences of a bad feature are the probability times the consequences it creates. That's the expected value. And they said, well, maybe I could reduce the probability of failure by a factor of 10 to the sixth, but that's going to be really hard. I can reduce the number of people that it affects by a factor of 10 to the sixth really easily by bringing it live to 1,000 people. So, I think that type of thinking that says, oh, the reason these failures are painful is because of the consequence side of the equation, not the probability side. Can I manipulate the consequences? And you just see wonderful examples of people driving down consequences by, 6 orders of magnitude, which makes it possible to tolerate a failure rate at stages in the process that are much higher. And in fact, I would equate that's the way we run the internet, right? When we send a packet from a sender to a receiver, we do not do error correction on every hop. What we do is we've gotten so good at doing end-to-end error correction that we can eliminate the error checking on the intermediate hops and have massive increases in speed and throughput because we don't have to stop after every hop and recheck the entire. So I think we're getting good at that type of thinking in terms of saying our old version was it costs 1,000,000 times as much to fix the error in the field, therefore no errors should get to the field. And I think people are willing to rethink that wisdom.
Hey, Gene, there are times when you have to be very reliable. And so much of the DevOps work is integrated tool chains, validated quality through automation to make sure that when you do deploy this thing, you don't blow the entire footprint. However, I don't see as much written about recovery because the fact is mistakes are made in these rapid deploys, right? So how do we react or respond, or what do you tell companies that say we're going to deploy really, really frequently? We're going to take more risk than we did before, like Don said. There's potentially some variability in outcome. How do you revert? How do you get back? Do you just make sure that it's a tiny one and you just pull it back on a string, or how do you think about this from a deployment perspective?
Yeah, I love that. And by the way, for those of you who want to learn more about kind of those practices at Facebook, Kent Beck recently gave a presentation at the Yao Singapore conference that was just dazzling, kind of summing up his learnings at Facebook. I think he was there for 7 years and describing kind of exactly how they reduce risk by creating concentric rings of exposure. So that's definitely one pattern where the only people who could be impacted were internal Facebook engineers, and then tens of users, hundreds of users, thousands of users, and so forth. So that was a huge aha moment for me. The second kind of really huge aha moment that I had in my understanding of how this crazy new world works was watching how deploys were done at Etsy. So I think this is 2011 or 2012. I got to spend a day with the team at Etsy, and they were describing how they, what a day looked like. And so this is when they were doing maybe 50, 80, 100 deployments per day. And it was so different than anything I'd ever seen. Essentially, people would, all the engineers who had features ready to go into production, they would start queuing up. There was a line to get into the integration test environment, essentially, like a stage. They would do the deployments there. And when they're done, they get in line for the production change. So they're just waiting for people to complete their deployments. They're being done one at a time. In this case, PHP, right? Then you can sort of see, your third in line, your second in line, your first in line. All right, it's your turn. You go in there, you push your changes out, you look at all the telemetry, you make sure that everything's kind of working as designed. You know, if everything flatlines, well, then you either back out or you fix forward, but you don't leave until, until things are back into some sort of normal operating state. And you certainly don't let someone else start the deployments until, we're back in some sort of stable state. And that for me was dazzling. It was so different than anything I'd ever seen. And just how, yes, it looked a little chaotic and looked, in some ways uncontrolled. There weren't a lot of, formal gates, but it was enough to have a very fast flow of features going to production with control. And so that to me was such an eye opener in terms of what work could look like. And,
you made a key point, and if it goes flatline, they back it out. Don't you have to design to be able to back it out? You can't build systems with one-way feed forward, unrecoverable changes, right? Transactions happened. It's not working. I lost the transactions. Is that part of the science of DevOps?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I mean, now that you mention it, I mean, that kind of got, that leads me to sort of like the other sort of like thing that struck me initially as immoral, right? When I heard this, I think it was at InView, where they did everything they could to avoid database schema changes. So what it meant is that you would have code to support multiple, essentially schemas that are living in production at the same time, right? And the way I was trained in computer science, right, it was, that was never done, right? It was the database's job to have a single consistent view of the world, right? And it was it was to save application developers from, complexity. And what they're saying is that those schema changes were so risky, right? There were global changes that could take down the entire site. It was actually better to have multiple schemas, versions of a schema in production, right? And that cost far outweighs the benefit you would get by having these very risky schema changes. So yeah, it's all about rethinking about the way we design our systems, to accommodate this very different way of working. By the way, does that do any of these stories strike you as shocking to some version of you in the past?
Yeah, I'm going to pass this to Mik and ask a different question. I know, Mik, because we talk that you engage with executives around the world, CIOs and others, about business agility, not just the tech stack stuff. When you talk about business agility, we talk about this variability, which is inherent in our world. I think the average executive wants to simply reduce variability. I want to know what next year's outcome is. I need to know what the investment's going to be, how many people we're going to have, what products you get launched. That's a natural state. People want certainty. We're in a world where we're now saying there's no certainty in this process. I think Agile and Lean basically say we're going to get fast feedback instead. How do executives respond to the fact that mistakes are going to be made, or we're going to be more tolerant of mistakes? How do you coach them through that?
Yeah, so I think that's the key question, Dean. So let's just take the executives I've worked with who have had tremendous success rolling out SAFe, and then the ones who are still looking for that. Some things go sideways. So I keep asking myself, what or their DevOps initiatives or their cloud initiatives. And it's interesting because each of those things we know to be the best practices that so many companies are getting so much value from. So for me, the question is, of those three key sets of practices, why are things going sideways, and where are the executives potentially misguiding the organization because they're missing something around, as Gene put it, the structure, the dynamics of software delivery and software innovation. So I keep asking these questions, and you just keep asking why, and you start seeing some similar things. I really liked Steve Maynard's things that you should stop doing in your SAFe rollout, like measuring family metrics, taking this over prescriptive, thinking dependencies are immutable, that you actually can't change your organization or your software architecture. But I had this pretty big aha. It was earlier this week where I was working with this organization, and they had this really large financial services organization, and they had done a really successful lean transformation on their front office, on their operations, of how they process claims and mortgages, all of those aspects of customer work. And that transformation had been going sideways. And it was going sideways when they approached it from that kind of, and Don, you touched on some of these key points, but from that process optimization point of view. They realized that whenever they were optimizing for cost, the costs were just rising and the customer value was not increasing. Gene, fifth ideal from Unicorn Project here, this very profound but somehow so often ignored thing, that when they started optimizing for customer value, so how quickly a customer was able to get a mortgage, and made cost be a secondary thing that it was being optimized for, all of the sudden, costs went down, customer service went up. So this is really interesting to this executives, that when you optimize for costs, you drive costs up. When you optimize for customer value, you drive costs down and you get more value to the customer. And so that, that kind of works in terms of their language. And they'd seen this. They'd seen this in another part of their business. So what I really realized is that these senior leaders after business agility, they've grown up with looking for economies of scale and for what the unit costs are. And the problem is that they've not understood the economics of flow. So that WIP example is a great example. They keep driving up WIP on their value streams. They keep making backlogs grow indefinitely in well-structured arts, right? In otherwise well-structured things. But until there's an understanding that when WIP grows too high, you get less out of your people and or robots, not more, the dynamics are all wrong. So I think the problem is that those leaders who just don't have that foundation of the economics around flow, around product development flow, they're applying this misguided industrial mindset on, and again, this is where I think some of Don's Deming points really ring true, on thinking that these things that worked for manufacturing or worked for pre-manufacturing ways of delivering value, such as reducing variability, such as focusing on prevention, focusing on mean time to failure as the #1 metric, not mean time to repair, as tech giants do, they've just got the wrong economic model. And so to me, to get them to the benefits of business agility, it's all around giving them the right economic model around flow.
Hey, Don.
I think that's a classic example of system thinking error, where you say, okay, when Mik was talking about flow efficiency and how you could have 1% flow. In a queuing system, what happens is if you're only interested in the efficiency of the server and things like that, if you locally optimize the server, you run it at 99% utilization. And you completely ignore the consequences of what you've done to service by creating extremely large wait times. And if you could get the executives to look at it as a system level problem, that there are two components of value and the efficiency is only one of the pieces of value, I think you can really, they're not stupid people. Often they're framing the problem incorrectly. The other thing I find very interesting is at a more senior executive level, there's a lot of value in saying, what you call portfolio management in the world of product development would be laughed out in the world of finance as portfolio management. In portfolio management in the world of finance often ends up combining assets that have low variability with assets that have high variability. If you only wanted predictable returns, you would have all your money in cash and collect 0.01% interest. You won't put 100% of your money in highly risky investments. And what you try to do is you try to have sufficient amount in low risk stuff that the probability of ruin is very small. And I think that is a language they understand when you talk about the domain of finance. They do not apply that sort of thinking in the domain of product development, portfolio management, but I think it's something they could understand were it framed that way to them.
This discussion around utilization and WIP and touch time is really interesting. And Don, I give you credit. When I read your book, I started to know why the things I tended to believe based upon empirical evidence actually were based upon principles. Yeah. And one of those is when I started to understand utilization. And I'll bet I can look at Mik right now and say that company that achieved the 1% efficiency, I'll bet the people were incredibly busy and incredibly utilized.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The dev teams were at 99%, as Don pointed out.
So somewhere back from theory of constraints from Goldratt to here, we had to learn as executives that, yeah, busy hands are happy hands. but they have to be busy doing some of the things that weren't anticipated during the planning process. So it's okay to work hard and be well utilized. I'd like to think that I am, but if I don't have any capacity for change or things that happen, I have to re-record a customer interview, then all of a sudden productivity and throughput goes down. So I think if we can help our executives, and Mik, you said executives don't understand product development flow. True, we didn't grow up with it, and not everyone is a lifelong learner that grabs all your books. A note on utilization. Gene, what do you think about utilization as one of the measures? I saw the people in the Unicorn Project were all pretty busy too.
Yeah, yeah, to the point where all of the kind of active forces for change had to be done after hours, right? To the people who believe so firmly that not only could they not get approval, but they were having to do it essentially on their own time. But that was their conviction. Yeah, one of my favorite graphs that I learned in the theory of constraints community is that derivation of Lil's law of what happens as you ramp up utilization, what happens to the wait times, and the graph that actually showed up in the book was actually generated from an Excel spreadsheet that was trying to recreate that graph, and it is such a startling one that if you have 5 steps, what really are the implications when you have something as simple as 5 steps, right, of which everyone is utilized at 99%. You're looking at lead times measured in weeks, right? And it seems
basically. If the process you're addressing is already running at 100% utilization, your wait time is infinite, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the sad part is that for some of these large complex organizations, the number of steps is not 5; it's probably more like 50. Right? It's 50 teams who all have something to do, with the work required to create value for the customer. So absolutely. And I think what book was the first that was it DeMarco who wrote the book Slack? Yeah, I remember reading that book 20 years ago, and I kind of dismissed it because I didn't really.
It didn't feel right.
Yeah, it seemed as crazy as pair programming did to me back then. Where just maybe on a kind of a intellectual level, right? I could sort of buy it, but kind of at a visceral, do I really believe it? Right? I didn't have that moment until many, many years later, and so I think it's really showing that all of these notions that you have to have Slack in the system, you have to have. Is all showing that, they were right decades ago.
As much as we've talked about flow and throughput and WIP, I'm going to ask a different question now, which is actually, Andy reminded me that in February, it's a 20th anniversary of the Agile Manifesto. Now, I was triggered by that to a new way of working. I joined an Agile team a couple years later, and frankly, I still do what I do because I love working on my Agile team. It's nothing like being a part of an Agile team. Agile Alliance was canceled this year because it's a face-to-face conference. They didn't believe they could make it work virtually. I don't remember exactly, but I don't think that any of your work say Agile is the way of working for all of this. So is Agile just assumed or irrelevant, or why do your books, which are so powerful and so well read, almost avoid the term? Maybe that's too strong a word. I'll start with Don on the right again and say, Don, is product development flow Agile, or is Agile supported, or are they just Mars and Venus?
Well, I'd have to say that of the 175 principles, there are 2 agility principles. No, I don't use the term Agile very much and things like that. I talk about 2 aspects of agility. One is the notion that I like the sports definition of agility, which is the ability to quickly change direction while you are running at speed. Changing direction when you're stationary is not agility, but when you have momentum built up in a certain direction, to massively redirect momentum, which requires a large impulse of force and things like that. I like that as a great definition of agility. So I use the term in a more classic sense. And I also emphasize the fact that the more agile you are, the shorter you can make your planning horizons. That when you're driving a super tanker and you cannot change direction quickly, you're going to be forced to plan at a horizon where there is massive uncertainty. But I think at the same time as I don't use, I maybe use the word agile a dozen times in the book, much of the underlying logic behind agile is exploiting the same DNA that I talk about in my book. So I think to people who understand agile and understand my book, they say you're talking about agile. My book keeps ending up on agile book lists and things like that. For people whose only understanding of agile is that if I see the word agile, that means it's talking about agile, then they say, oh, Don's book is not about agile.
Yeah. So when I see even basic Scrum, 2-week sprint cycle, that naturally limits WIP. When we say that we're going to try to leave the team alone for that period of time, that naturally limits interruptions in WIP. So I see the common elements there.
Yeah, it's the reduction of batch size, it's the reduction of WIP. I think actually one of the most central sea changes about Agile compared to traditional waterfall models was the notion that in waterfall, conforming to the requirement, the original requirement, was represented as the highest form of perfection. In Agile, we finally opened ourselves up to the idea that when you deviate from plan, you should ask yourself the question, is the cost of returning to plan higher or lower than the value of returning to plan? And Agile permitted us to say, oh, we've deviated from plan in an inconsequential way. The target has moved on us. We should not religiously focus on our original plan. We need to make good business decisions as we proceed through development. And I think that's a massively liberating view towards product development.
I think there's some logic in me moving through DevOps to get to project to product. So I'm going to stop at Gene now and say, Gene, is it just assumed? Could we care less? Why aren't you an Agile proponent out there in the manifesto?
Oh, very much. I am an Agile and DevOps proponent, and I think there's really kind of two ways to answer your question. One is in kind of the novel treatments, the business novel fable treatment in Phoenix Project and Unicorn Project. Agile and DevOps, I think, appear both once in each book, right? And I think the goal is really to tell the story of like what are the problems that cause us to, believe so strongly that things like an Agile and DevOps are needed, right? So I kind of viewed it as even using the word might create objections that are not even material. We're not even at the stage where we should be talking about like whether certain practices are needed. In the DevOps handbook and others, right? I mean, then, it's mentioned all the time. And one of the things that I really admire about your work, Dean, is that I think we both love methodologies. We love kind of bringing the world to order by describing things, right? You go into any grocery store and a banana is, the UPC code is 4011, right? I think. And so it's really nice that, when we can talk about things and have a standard word for it, and, we can know what that has a certain level of precision in terms of how we think about it. And one of the biggest surprises to me learning about SAFe was how strictly it adhered to the Scrum terminology, which I actually love, just because, why bother trying to teach someone something if it's the same thing? Like, why do we need to give it a different name? And I thought that was actually just a brilliant decision. And by the way, the other thing I loved about SAFe is just how highly technical practices are elevated in it in a very Kent Beckian sort of way, harkening all the way back to extreme programming. I do believe, and I think another thing that SAFe does so well is really say it's all about principles from which you derive practices from. So in the,
I actually learned Lean first, XP second, and Scrum third. So that's my opinion. Mik, you and I worked probably 10 years ago in parallel back at a company called Nokia, trying to bring a high degree of agility to their phone business. I know you were there. I don't think I met you when you were there, but I know you're an Agilist at heart. So tell me about how project to product doesn't really camp on that word.
Yeah, and for me, it's the answer is it's in project to product, it's assumed. So project to product actually spells it out exactly this way. You need to be doing SAFe or you need to be doing something just like it and have reinvented it yourself, as we've seen some tech giants do. They didn't come at it from that angle. They basically made these practices, these terminologies themselves. I'm a big fan of SAFe because the work's been done for your organization, so you can actually spend your efforts on the next levels of maturity, such as scaling your DevOps practices. So for me, it's Agile, SAFe, or something just like it are required to take that next step. End of story. And so the question to me is, what's the next step, right? And this is, we can see this in what's happening with SAFe, right? We can see that the next step is about product value streams, and it always has been about value streams, but it's elevating those to business agility, to the business, that they don't stop at the IT team, at the development team. The business needs to operate around product value streams. That, you know, that lean budgets are a very important direct thing to think of, that design thinking is key. So for me, it's absolutely assumed. And I think the fascinating thing is then, you know, how do we take that next step? And the thing that Dawn previously said around portfolios is, I think, where the principles around SAFe, the principles around XP, the principles around Agile, how we can bring them to the business more quickly. So in the end, for these senior business leaders, it is around managing portfolios. And they're currently just managing portfolios of projects and costs. So unless we give them a way to elevate what we know works for Agile, what we know works for product development flow, to give them a model by which they can manage portfolios and actually understand the low variability versus high variability parts of their portfolios. So, you know, oftentimes, Dean, back to your questions on the CIOs, you know, there'll be the question, like, do we need to move everything to cloud? It's like, no, of course not. You're not going to move your really high, low variability COBOL transaction processing stuff to cloud tomorrow. That's insane. You're going to, you know, Gene and I, when we visited CompuWare, we saw you're going to either basically bring on a SaaS solution and just kill that stuff off because it's context not core, or you're going to let it be and be happy with 6 month cycle times and just keep the risks on it low and make sure it stays running while you put your innovation into your transformation zone initiatives, into the places that are going to really fuel your business. So I think the key thing is we need to take this thinking that we've got and allow business leaders to structure these portfolios of their arts, of their value streams, and understand that different parts of the portfolio actually have different needs. So you have to have a different leader for an incubation part of your portfolio that better be cloud native and have A/B testing and the ability to, you know, blue-green launches and so on. Whereas for other parts of your portfolio that are currently supporting your bottom line or key parts of your top line, you actually need to take a different approach. And maybe your flow time metrics will actually look a bit different, and definitely your business metrics will look different. So, Dean, it's assumed, but if we don't elevate it to the boardroom soon, we'll continue hitting our head against that brick wall, which I think we've all been doing quite effectively. Gene's pushed the boundaries with Unicorn Project to the boardroom, right? And Phoenix Project started that journey. You've pushed ahead on business agility, so I'm hoping we're making progress on that front. So,
one
Gene,
question
go ahead.
One question I always found useful over the years is somebody would come to me and say, I want to shorten my development cycle time or do X. And I always say, what makes you think you will make money by doing that? And that was how you distinguished between somebody who was pursuing the flavor of the month or somebody who had actually thought through what changes they were trying to get and how it was going to impact their business. And so I find in many, many cases, pushing people to have greater clarity about how do they think that's going to impact the economics of their business really, you know, it holds a mirror up to their thinking that often reveals they haven't thought enough about things.
As we move towards close, I have a personal question for each of you, and I didn't give you the chance to see the question in advance. I did that on purpose, okay? I'm gonna start with Don, okay? And principles of product development flow. Don, did you think about having 50 principles of product development flow rather than 175? And why are they so rich and deep and varied?
Well, I didn't start with let's aim for 175 and then distribute that among different themes and things. What I was doing, it had been about 12 years since my previous book. There were a lot of things that I wanted to go deeper on, particularly operationally oriented stuff and stuff. So I started by writing down what do I think are the worthwhile things, that maybe some of the non-obvious things for people, and some obvious things they don't do enough. And then I just organized them into themes of chapters, and 175 was what I stopped at when I said, if you make the book more than 300 pages, nobody's going to read it. Now, I did try to pack 600 pages into 300 pages, but I did say you have to stop writing at some point.
Gene, your writing style is different. I'm jealous. You wrote the only tech book that my wife read and enjoyed. She doesn't read any of my stuff. She loved the Phoenix Project. She was up at like 11:30 at night saying, this is really cool. That's great. The Unicorn Project, I think, is interesting because when I went through it, I discovered, that's psychological safety. He didn't call it that, but that's what it was. Oh, that's batch size reduction. He didn't call it that, but that's what it was. That's A/B testing. He actually called it that. So the types of principles that we like to think we can record in SAFe and that Mik and Don express, they're in here, but they're in story form. How do you merge the thinking about psychological safety is an important part of thriving in the digital age and work that into a novel in a way that you can still read it and get both ideas. It's a fun story, and you see these vignettes and principles buried in the story. How do you do that?
Oh, great question. It's funny. It's going to recall several elements of what you just told, Dean. There were two books that really heavily influenced my thinking and kind of shaped my career for almost 15 years. One is the book The Goal by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, the novel about a plant manager who has to fix his cost and due date issues in 90 days, otherwise they shut the plant down. So that is definitely kind of the lean manufacturing part. The other one was 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. And I also read a big chunk of that on a plane, and it was so disturbing and frustrating for me that I actually wanted to throw the book across the cabin. I mean, it kind of resonated so deeply with certain dysfunctions that I was living through at the time at a startup. And I just remember like having like sweaty armpits. Right? I mean, I was so physically recoiling from the book. It was really hard to keep going. And so I've always wanted to be able to evoke the same sort of emotions, whether it's a problematic deployment or the feelings of helplessness when you know what the right thing to do is and you can't convince the other people around you, right? And the notion of psychological safety, right? I mean, I think we've all been at some point in our career in situations where it was not safe to tell bad news. It was not safe to, say what you really thought. And, I think now there's a whole bunch of literature around that gives us the words to, say, here are the attributes and specific conditions of that. And so it was just, for me, the goal was to be able to, in a very Patrick Lencioni-like way, kind of evoke that reaction. So.
Hey, Mik, I'm still mad at you because you stole the title of what I thought my next book would be. So it's going to take me a while to get over that. And I'm totally stumped. I don't know what to write next. This is a really interesting book. It's probably, 2 years maybe?
Yeah, it's 2 years now. Almost exactly. Yeah.
This is another book. When I saw it, I got it. It's like, that's why the empirical things I'm seeing actually make sense. What was the epiphany? So when you read about the book, you read about flow, you read about the flow framework, you read about measuring things that matter, like technical debt, right? You specifically say it's important to measure technical debt so that you know when you reduce it. How does that lead you to project to product? What was the epiphany that said, oh, that's the message. If we install product thinking, a lot of these issues are going to go away. Some connection between product and flow is kind of inferred. Maybe it's explicit, but tell me explicitly, what is that connection?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, for me, it's a little bit different than it's actually told in the book. But as a developer, I realized that one of the most important things that help me reason in new ways and become more effective, and for me being more effective as developers, being able to large and manage larger systems, basically, larger software going. You start with writing tens of thousands, to hundreds of thousands, and then you get into these million lines of code where things get interesting. And I realized that there's always a currency in terms of the way I think about modularity. So at first the currency was just a function, and then a class, and then you start thinking about components, and then you actually start thinking that, then the currency when you start deploying large scale software was the server, then it became the virtual machine, now the container. And so I always thought of, it was so helpful for me to understand what the currency that I was measuring was and that I was optimizing for and I was learning about was. And when I was trying to understand why, again, this body of work that all of you created which to me made perfect sense, was being applied in just such a small sliver of the economy. Like Gene said, 18 million developers working in just completely insane ways, whereas a small portion get it and are winning more and more of the economy. So I understand, and I realized that the currency by which the business was managing innovation and software is just wrong, right? That currency came out of a cost center and of projects and activities, and was not the way any of us actually thought about innovation, because we think about innovation as in customer first, and how we're delighting our end users, our customers, and how much value we're flowing to them and how quickly. So I realized that to get people to change and to make the shift from projects, which in the end are about costs and activities and project plans, to thinking in a customer-centric way and thinking backwards from the customer, we actually had to change the model. We had to change what the portfolio was measured on. And the portfolio needed to be measured on products and value streams that give everyone involved the opportunity to deliver great things for the customers, rather than projects and cost centers. So really that was it, is that at the top level of the organization, you need to install this new model through which you can measure flow, through which you can know where to invest to make sure your developers aren't thrashing, but are able to build great things, aren't stuck waiting for 3 weeks on a screen or a security review. So that was really the shift. And I realized that the work that we needed to do to enable that, because again, in terms of the actual principles, things like that the flow frame tries to embody, those were all defined by you already. So I just tried to make a more pragmatic way of measuring them in the flow framework that you could easily attach to things like SAFe, to things like your DevOps transformation. And again, help elevate the practices that you and the rest of the community define to the boardroom and the executive suite.
So thanks, gentlemen. I have one more question. It's more of a wish. You're not done writing, are you? Mik?
No. Don't tell anyone though, because I
too late for
that. A lot of work.
Dean?
Yeah, in fact, I'm in the early stages of writing something, and maybe Dean, I can't wait to tell you and get your thoughts on it in the months to come.
Good, great. And Don?
Got a few unfinished projects in the writing space.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. I'm sure that SAFe practitioners and others who will find their way to this video are informed. And the good news is we have a short course here. These words are documented. These thoughts are preserved. You've taken the time to do one of the hardest things I've ever done, write a book. You know how consuming that is. So we appreciate your contribution to the industry. And for me to move forward and have new learnings, I'm going to need some help. You guys need to write the things I need to synthesize later for our audience. So thank you very much for your time. And thanks to our audience for paying attention to this fascinating panel today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you in the field for sure.